Chapter 8. The snow was falling thickly when Olaf came out into the yard at dusk on St. Catherine's Eve. It was the first snowfall of the year. His footprints showed black on the ground as he ran across to the stable. He stood for a moment before the stable door, watching the whirling mass of white. His eyes blinked as the snowflakes fell on his long lashes. They felt like a light caress against his skin. The forest below the manor on the north and east, which in autumn nights had been full of gloom and desolation, now seemed near and shone like a white and friendly wall through the driving snow and the gathering darkness. Olaf felt glad at the snow. Someone within the stable was speaking in a loud voice. The door flew open behind him and a man dashed out as if he had been thrown. He pitched against Olaf and both went to the ground. The other got onto his feet and shouted back to someone standing in the doorway, a vague black figure in the pale gleam of the lantern. "Here is one more for you to show your manhood on, Arnvid," with which he ran off into the snow and the darkness. Olaf shook himself and dived in under the doorway. What was that with Gudmund? When, in the shadow behind Arnvid, he caught sight of a girl in tears. "Get out, foul slut," Arnvid said to her, furious. The woman slunk, crouching, past the men and out. Arnvid barred the door behind her. "What is it?" asked Olaf again. "Oh, no great thing, as you may think," said Arnvid hotly. He picked up the little lantern and hung it on the hook. Olaf saw that he was trembling with agitation. "Nothing else but that now every whore's son who serves about the place seems to think he dare scorn me, because I have said I will not have womenfolk in the stables. 'Tis unfitting. Gudmund answered me that I should rather keep a watch on the bowers here and on my kinswomen." Olaf turned away. In the darkness beyond, the horses could be heard crunching their fodder and stamping their feet. The nearest stretched his neck and snorted at Olaf, and the flame of the lantern was reflected in its dark eyes. "Did you hear?" Arnvid insisted. Olaf turned to the horse and did not answer. He felt in agony that he was blushing violently. "What have you to say to that?" asked Arnvid hotly. "What would you have me say?" answered Olaf in a low voice. "As my case stood, after the answer Kolbein gave me, you cannot well be surprised that I followed your advice." "My advice?" "The advice you gave me that day we spoke together up in the woods. You said that when two persons under age have been betrothed by their lawful guardians, none has the right to part them. But if they agree to follow the designs of their parents, there is no need of more. They can come together as married folk." "I never said that." "I don't remember how the words went, but I guessed it to be your meaning." "My meaning?" whispered Arnvid, deeply moved. "No, Olaf, what I meant, I thought you knew." "No. What did you mean, then?" asked Olaf, point-blank, turning toward the other. Driven by a sense of utter shame, he hardened himself, looked his friend defiantly in the eyes, while his face was on fire. But Arnvid Finnsson dropped his eyes before the younger man and blushed in his turn. What he had thought he could not say, and he found it hard to undeceive himself now. Confusion and shame made him speechless. That he had kept up familiar friendship with a man whom he himself believed to be the seducer of his kinswoman, how ill it looked he seemed not to have guessed till now. It was as though he had not seen its ugly, dishonourable side before. Because Olaf seemed so honourable all through, he had been blind to the dishonour when it was Olaf. Nor could he believe it now, that Olaf stood there lying to him. He had always held Olaf to be the most truthful of all men, and he clutched at it now. Olaf's words must be worthy of belief. He himself must have wronged his friend with his suspicion in the summer. So it must be. There had been nothing unseemly between the two, though they had been together at night in the summer. "I have always thought well of you, Olaf," he said. "Believed you jealous of your honour." "Then you could not well expect," Olaf broke in hotly, still staring the other in the face, "that I should lie down tamely and let the Torretons trample on my honour and cheat me of my right. I will not go home to my country in such a way that every man may mock at me and say I let these men defraud me of the marriage I should have made. You know that they use fraud against me, Kolbein and those. You remember how I got back my ring?" Arnvid nodded. When the property was divided, Kolbein had given back to Olaf the chests of movables which Steinfinn had taken charge of for his foster son. But then Olaf's mother's signet ring was among these goods, threaded on a ribbon together with some other rings. And Olaf could not say a word about his having lately seen the ring lying among Steinfinn's own treasures. "And in my eyes it concerns my father's honour too," Olaf continued excitedly. "If I am to let strangers set at naught his last will and the promises given to him before he died. And Steinfinn, you heard yourself what he said. But he knew well enough, poor man, that he had not the power to carry it against these overbearing brothers of his. Are Ingunn's father and my father to have so little respect in their graves that they are not to be allowed the right to dispose of their own children's marriage?" Arnvid reflected a long time. "Nonetheless, Olaf," he said slowly, "you must not now do such things as going to her in her bower and meet her secretly so that all the housefolk know of it. God knows I should have not kept my counsel so long, but it seemed to me an ill thing to speak of. You have not been afraid to show me disrespect." Olaf made no answer, and Arnvid felt sorry for him when he looked at him. Arnvid said, "I think, Olaf, since it has come to this between you and her, that you must take charge of the manor here." Olaf looked up with a question in his eyes. "Declare to the housefolk here that you will not give way to the new sponsors, but hold them to the bargain Steinfinn and your father made, and take your wife to yourself. Step into the master's bed with Ingunn and declare that now you think that you are the next of kin to have charge for Halvard and John, so long as you and Ingunn stay here in the north." Olaf stood biting his lip. His cheeks were burning. At first Arnvid's advice tempted him unspeakably. This was the plain road, out of all the furtive dealings by night and by stealth which, he felt, were making him a meaner and a weaklier man. Take Ingunn by the hand and boldly lead her to the bed and high seat left by Steinfinn and Ingeborg. Then let them talk about that, all these folk about the place who giggled and muttered behind his back, though as yet they had not dared to come out with it straight to his face. But then his courage sank when he thought of carrying it out. It was their sneers, their nasty little words. They were so apt at that, the people hereabouts. With an innocent look, making it hard for a man to return an answer and defend himself, they dropped a few sly words with a sting in them. Many a time the malice in their speech was hidden so cunningly that it was a little while before he guessed what the men were smiling at, when one of them broke off with too unconcerned an air, or gave a start. Without being aware of it, he had striven in all his doing at Fretestein so to conduct himself as to give them no occasion to make that sort of game of him. Until now he had exceeded in some measure. He knew that his fellow servants liked him well enough, and stood in a sort of awe of him, as happens when a man is sparing of words, but is known not to be a fool. Thus he may easily be accounted wiser than he is. As yet, no one had dared to hint at what all knew of him and Ingunn. No word, at least, had come to his ears. But he flinched at the thought. The laughter and the jesting would break out, sure enough, when he himself made no secret of the matter and offered to take over the stewardship of the farm, where he had been reckoned a young lad until this year. Insensibly, Olaf's view of himself and of his position on Steinfinns' estate had changed. He no longer counted Frettestein as the home to which he had belonged as one of the children of the house. The chance words that had trickled into his mind, the fact that Ingunn's kinsmen disregarded him, the stings of an evil conscience, and the sense of shame at all he had done in secret, made him see himself in a meaner light than before. And then there was this, that he was so young. All the other men of the place were much older than he. He was well used, indeed, to their counting him and Ingunn as not yet fully grown. And he blushed at the thought of having to own that he was living with a woman, when no grown man had led him forward and accepted him in the ranks of husbands. Without that he could not feel that it was real. At length he replied, "It is not to be done, Arnvid. Do you think either man or woman here would obey me if I tried to command? Grim, or Joseph, or Gudmund? Or would Dala willingly give up her keys to Ingunn? No. Ingunn would have to be content to wear the coif." Arnvid gave a little laugh. "Till you can give her the keys of Hestviken." "No, Arnvid. They go in fear of Kolbein, every mother's son here. What you counsel is impossible." "Then I know of only one other way, and this counsel I should have given you long ago. God forgive me. Go to Hamar and put your case in the bishop's hands." "In Bishop Thorfinn's? I don't think I can look for much mercy of him," said Olaf slowly. "You're right, you may look for," replied Arnvid. "In this question it is only Holy Church that can judge. You two can only be married to each other. Who knows if the pious father will not let us be monk and nun, send us to the cloister to expiate our sin? He will assuredly make you do penance to the church for going to your bride without banns or wedding. But if you can bring forward witnesses that the betrothal is valid, and that, I think, we can surely do, he will demand of the Torresons that they accept offers of honourable atonement." "Do you think," Olaf broke in, "it will avail much if the Lord Thorfinn demanded? Before now the Bishop of Hamar has had to give way to the Steinfinnsons." "Yes, in questions of property and the like. But for all that, they are not so ungodly as to deny that in this matter none has the right to judge but the fathers of the church, whether marriage be marriage or not." "I wonder. Oh, no. Then I have more mind to take Ingunn with me and fare south to my own country." "Ah, not so long as I can wield a sword. In the devil's name, Olaf, do you expect, because I have lacked counsel for so long, that I should sit here and shut my eyes while you steal my kinswoman out of my ward?" He saw that Olaf was on the point of flaring up. "Be calm," he said curtly. "I know you are not afraid of me, and I am not afraid of you either. But I reckoned we were friends. If you feel yourself that your conduct to me has been something short of a trusty friend's, then do as I say. Seek to make an end of this matter in seemliness and honour. I shall go with you to the bishop," he added, seeing that the other still hesitated. "Against my will I do this thing," said Olaf with a sigh. "Is it more to your liking as things are now," Arnvid rejoined hotly, "to let the talk go on, here on the manor and among the neighbours, of you and me and Ingunn? Can you not see that the women folk smirk and whisper behind her back wherever she goes, stare at her slyly, They look to see if she treads as lightly as ever. There is no danger on that score, muttered Olaf angrily. So she says. His face was crimson again. Ingunn must stay with us then, he said reflectively. Else it might be difficult even for Bishop Thorfinn to get her out of Kolbein's clutches. Yes, I shall take Tora and Ingunn with me. Do you think I would let her fall into Kolbein's hands after this? So be it then, answered Olaf. He stared gloomily before him. 2 days later they rode down and reached the town late in the evening. The maids were long abed next morning, and Olaf said he would go seek the smith and fetch his axe, while the others made ready to hear the last mass that was sung in Christ Church. They had already set out when he came back to the inn. He hurried after them along the street, and the snow crunched under him. It was fine, frosty weather. The bells rang out so sweetly in the clear air, and the southern sky was so finely tinged with gold above white ridges and dark blue water. He saw the others by the churchyard gate and ran up to them. Ingunn turned toward him, flushing red as a rose. Olaf saw that under her hood she wore a white coif about her face like a young wife. He turned red too, and his heart began to hammer. This was dead earnest. It was as though he had not known it till now. Young as he was and lacking friends and kinsmen, he had taken this upon himself, to face it out, that she was his wife. And it made him terribly bashful to walk beside her thus. Straight as two candles, gazing fixedly before them, they strode side by side across the churchyard. After the morning meal, Olaf accompanied Arnvid to the bishop's palace. He was ill at ease during the walk, and it was no better when he had to sit waiting by himself in the bishop's stone hall, after a clerk had taken Arnvid up to Lord Thorfinn in the bishop's bedchamber. The time dragged on and on. Olaf had never been in a stone hall before, and there was much to look at. The roof was also of stone and vaulted, so that no light came in except from a little glazed window in the back wall. But in spite of that it was not so very dark, as the room was whitewashed within, and the walls were painted with bright flowers and birds in place of tapestries, and to the same height. The room was without any sort of fireplace, but as soon as he had entered, 2 men came in bearing a great brazier, which they placed in the middle of the floor. Olaf went up and warmed his hands over it, when he grew tired of sitting and freezing on the bench. He was left to sit alone most of the time, and he was ill at ease in this hall. There was something church-like about it which unsettled him. After a while 3 men came in, clad in furs. They placed themselves around the charcoal brazier and took no notice of the boy upon the bench. They had come about a case they had, of fishing rights. The 2 old ones were farmers from somewhere about Fagerberg, and the younger one was a priest and stepson of one of the farmers. Olaf was made to feel very young and inexperienced. It would surely not be easy for him to assert himself here. Soon one of the bishop's men came and fetched them away. Olaf himself would have been glad to go out into the palace yard too. There were many things to look at. But he judged that this would be unbecoming. He would have to stay where he was. At last Arnvid came in great haste, snatched his sword and buckled it on, saying that the bishop was to ride out to a house in Vang and had bidden him go with him. No, he had not been able to say much about Olaf's case. Folk had been coming and going in the bishop's chamber the whole morning. No, the bishop had not said much, but he had invited both Arnvid and Olaf to lodge in the palace. So now Olaf must go back to the inn and bring his horse and their things. What of the maids? They cannot be left behind in the inn." "No," said Arnvid. "They were to lodge in a house in the town, with 2 pious old women who had boarders. In a day or 2 they would be joined by Magnhild, Steinfinn's sister from Berg. The bishop would send a letter tomorrow, bidding her come. He says you and Ingunn ought not to meet until a reconciliation be made in this affair, except, as you know, you may see each other in church and speak together there." Arnvid dashed out. Olaf hurried to the inn, but one of these women from the guest house was there before him, and Ingunn and Tora were ready to go with her. So he was not able to speak to her. She looked sorrowful as he gave her his hand in farewell. But Olaf said to Tora, so that her sister might hear, that the bishop had received them well. It was a great mark of favour that all 4 were to be his guests. But when he came back to the bishop's palace, he was met by a young priest who said they were to be contubernalis. Olaf guessed that this meant he was to sleep in this priest's room. He was a tall, lean man, with a big, bony horse's head, and they called him Asbjorn Allfat. He got a man to take charge of Olaf's horse, and himself showed the young man to the loft where he was to sleep. Then he said he must go down to the boat hithe. A vessel had come in that morning with goods from Gudbrandsdal. Maybe it would amuse Olaf to go with him and look on. Olaf was glad to accept. There was much shipping at Hestviken, Olaf knew, and yet no man could know less of ships and boats than he, so strangely had his life been ordered. He used both eyes and ears when aboard the trading vessel, made bold even to ask about one thing and another. He took a hand with the men and helped to discharge the freight. It was a better pastime than standing by with idle hands. Most of it was barrels of salt herrings and sea trout, but there were also bales of hides and a quantity of furs, butter and tallow. While the priest kept the tally, Olaf helped him, notching the stick. In this he had had practice at Fretterstein, as he had often done it for Grim. The old man was not very good at reckoning now. He kept with Asbjorn priest the whole day, followed him to prayers in the choir of the church and to supper, which Olaf was to take at the same table as the bishop's household. And when at night he went to the loft with Asbjorn and another priest, he was in a much better frame of mind. He no longer felt such a stranger in the palace, and there were many new things to see. Arnvid was not yet come home. But in the course of the night Olaf awoke, and lay thinking of all that had been told him of Bishop Thorfinn. He was afraid of the bishop after all. Rather let 10 men lose their lives than one maiden be ravished, he was reported to have said. There was a case that had been much talked about in the country round a year before. A rich man's son in Alfheim had set his mind on a poor peasant's daughter. As he could not tempt the woman with promises and gifts, he came one evening in springtime when the girl was ploughing, and tried to use force. Her father was below in the wood, busy with the mending of a fence. He was old and ailing, but on hearing his daughter's cries, he took his woodcutter's axe and ran up. He cleft the other's skull. The ravisher was left unatoned. His kinsman had to be content with that. But as was natural, they tried to get the slayer to leave the country. First, they offered to buy him out, but when he would not have it, they fell upon him with threats and overbearing treatment. Then Bishop Thorfinn had taken the poor peasant and his children under his protection. Then there was that case of the man at Tonstad who had been found slain in his coppice. His wife and children charged the other tenant of the farm with the murder. The man had to flee to save his life, and his wife and young children suffered affliction and cruelty without end at the hands of the murdered man's relatives. Then it came about that the dead man's own cousin confessed that he was the one who had killed his kinsman. they had quarrelled about an inheritance. But it was said that Bishop Thorfinn had forced the murderer to avow before the people what he had confessed to the bishop, saying that no priest had power to absolve him of the sin before he had shown sincere repentance and rescued the innocent who might be suffering from his misdeed. Arnvid said that to the poor and sorrowing this bishop would stoop with the gentlest kindness, praying them to turn to him as to a loving father. But he never bowed his neck the least jot when faced with self-willing or hard-hearted men, whether they were great folk or small, clergy or laity. Never would he excuse sin in any man, but if any sinner showed repentance and the will to make amends, he received him with both hands, guided, consoled, and protected him. This was nobly done, Olav had thought, and much of what he had heard of the Lord Thorfinn he had liked very well. A fearless man this monk from Trondheim must be, and one who knew his own will. But then he had never thought that he himself would have a case to submit to the bishop's judgment. And what Arnvid said about the bishop's being no respecter of persons seemed to Olaf to be stretching his goodness somewhat far. He could see nothing else but that it did make some difference whether it were a lowly peasant who killed his neighbour for a small matter, or Steinfinn revenging himself upon Matthias. In any case, he would not like anyone to think he had turned to the bishop and sought his protection against the Steinfinnsons because he felt himself in a way their inferior. Then there was this other thing, that Bishop Thorfinn was so strict on the point of chastity. With all other men, he might hold to his assertion that this life he and Ingunn had led since the summer was wedlock in a way, but he did not feel it so himself. The next morning he sat waiting again in the little hall. It was so called because there was a larger hall or courthouse beside it. There was no door between. None of the rooms in the stone building had more than one door, and that led into the courtyard. Olaf had sat there a while when a little young man came in, clad in a greyish-white monk's frock, which was a little different from that of the preaching friars. The monk closed the door behind him and advanced rapidly to Olaf, and the young man got up in great haste and knelt upon one knee. He knew at once that this must be the Lord Thorfinn. When the bishop held out his hand, Olaf meekly kissed the great stone in his ring. "Welcome to Hamar, Olav Audunsson. 'Twas not well that I should be absent yesterday when you came, but I hope my housefolk have had good care of our guests." He was not so young, after all, Olaf saw. His thin wreath of hair shone like silver, and his face was shrunken, wrinkled, and grey as his frock almost. But he was slim and wonderfully lithe in all his movements, scarce so tall as Olaf. It was impossible to guess his age. His smile took away the look of age. A brightness came into his great yellow-grey eyes, but upon his pale and narrow lips the smile became the faintest shadow. Olaf mumbled his thanks and stood in embarrassment. The zealous bishop looked so utterly different from what he had expected. He remembered dimly that he had seen the former bishop, a man who filled a room with his voice and his presence. Olaf felt that this one could also fill the room, slight and silver-grey as he was, in another way. When Lord Thorfinn sat down and bade him be seated beside him, he modestly withdrew to the bench at a little distance. "There is great likelihood that you must be content to bide here a part of the winter," said Bishop Thorfinn. "You are a man of the Vik, I hear, that great bay in the south of Norway, and all your kinsmen dwell far away, save only the Veets folk out at Solja. It will take time ere we can receive their answer as to what their testimony may be in this matter. Do you know if they have resigned their guardianship of you in lawful wise?" "My father did so, Lord. Was it not he who had the right to that?" Yes, but he must have spoken of it to his kinsmen, and had their consent that Steinfinn should enjoy the payment for your wardship in place of them." Olaf was silent. This case of his did not seem so simple a matter, and he had guessed as much of late. No wardship payment from his estate had ever been made to Steinfinn, so far as he knew. "I know nothing of this. I know little of the law. No one has ever taught me such things," he said dejectedly. "No, I guessed that. But we must be clear about this question of guardianship, Olaf. First, on account of your share in the deed of arson. Whether you accompanied Steinfinn as his son-in-law, or as a man in his pay. Kolbein and those have got their freedom now, but you were not included in it. I shall speak with the sheriff about this matter so that you may be safe here in the town. But then there is that saying of Steinfinn before he died, that he desired the marriage between you and his daughter, as Arnvid tells me. Whether he were your guardian at that time, or these kinsmen of yours, who are so now." "I thought," said Olaf, turning red, "that I was come to man's estate, since she was betrothed to me in lawful wise, and I have taken her to me as my wife." The bishop shook his head. "Can you suppose that you two children have acquired any right in law, because you have gone to bed together as seems good to yourselves, without the presence of your kinsfolk, and without banns in church? A duty you have taken upon yourselves, since you acted in the belief that it was binding wedlock. You are now bound, under pain of mortal sin, to live together till death shall part you, or to remain single if we cannot bring about a reconciliation between her sponsors and yours. But you have not come to man's estate through a marriage of this sort, and your spokesman can demand no dowry on your behalf, until you have fallen at the feet of the Torresons and made amends to them. And it would be unlike them if they should be willing to grant you such dowry with Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter as a man of your condition might otherwise look to get with his wife. This game may cost you dear, Olaf. To the church you must do penance for making your marriage in secret, as she has forbidden all her children to do, since matters of matrimony are to be conducted in the light, in prudent and seemly fashion. Were it not so, too many folk might deal as you have dealt. You and this woman are bound by the promises you have made to God, but no man is bound to grant you rights or afford you support, since no men were present to make promises to you and for you when you bound yourself. "My lord," said Olav, "I had thought that you would defend our rights, since you yourself think we are bound to keep the faith we gave to each other." Had you submitted the case to the judgment of the church as soon as you saw that the maid's uncles were minded to oppose the validity of the betrothal, that would have been the right way. You could have claimed of my official, Arnbjorn Skolp, that he should forbid Kolbein under threat of ban to betroth Ingunn to another man, before it had been made clear whether you had already a right to this marriage. How much would Kolbein have cared for that? So much you know for all that. You have not learnt law, but you have seen unlawfulness. The bishop moved his hands in his lap under the scapula. You must bear in mind, Kolbein and Ivar have already so much on their hands that perchance they will not be so eager to have a matter of excommunication added. I thought it was held good enough, Olaf began again obstinately, that her father had handselled the maid to my father for my wife. No. The bishop shook his head. As I told you, guilt and duties you have gained, but no rights. Had you come to Arnbjorn with the matter while the girl was yet a maid, you had gained more than the best you can win now. Either they would have been forced to give you both the woman and her goods, or she and you could have parted and been free to make another marriage. As the matter now stands, my son, you must pray God to help you, that you may not repent by daylight, and in your manhood that you bound yourself hand and foot blindly and in darkness before you were wholly out of your childhood. That day will never come, said Olav hotly, when I repent me that I did not let Kolbein Bjorghild cheat me of what was mine by right. The bishop looked at him searchingly as Olaf went on. Oh no, my lord. Kolbein was resolved to upset this bargain, and small scruple will he have of the means he uses. That I know. He told the bishop of the betrothal ring. Are you sure, asked Lord Thorfinn, that Steinfinn had not replaced the ring in your coffer before he died? He may have thought it safer, so that you should surely receive again all that was yours, and that he had in charge for you. No, for it was on the morning of his death day that I saw Ingunn's betrothal ring. Then it lay in the casket in which Steinfinn kept his own and his children's most costly jewels. Was it Steinfinn himself who brought out the casket? Did he show you this? No, it was Arnvid did it. Well, then it looks as though Kolbein... The bishop paused for a moment, then turned to Olaf. As you two young people are placed, the best way will be, I do not say it is a perfect way, but the best, that your kinsman and hers assent to a marriage according to the law of the land, and that you be allowed to enjoy one another and all that you possess and are to bring to one another. Otherwise, life will be very difficult for you, and your feet will be beset with temptation to worse sins than this first sin, if you are parted. But you understand, I hope, that even if we can bring witnesses to the validity of the betrothal, the Torresons may make such conditions for reconciliation that you will be poorer by your marriage than you were before. Well, that is all one to me, said Olaf defiantly. The word that was given to my father shall not be broken because he is dead. I will have Ingunn home with me if I have to take her in bare shift. And what of this young Ingunn? Said the bishop quietly. Are you sure that she is of the same mind as you, that she would rather hold fast to the old bargain than be given to another man? Ingunn felt the same way I did. We should not set ourselves up against our father's will because they were dead, and strangers would diminish their right to dispose of their own children. Bishop Thorfinn did his best not to smile. So, you two children stole into the bridal bed simply to be obedient to your fathers. My lord, said Olaf in a low voice, turning red again. Ingunn and I are of even age, and we were brought up as brother and sister from the time we were small. From my 7th year I have lived far from all my kinsfolk, and when she lost both mother and father, she betook herself to me. Then we agreed that we would not let them part us. The bishop nodded slowly. Olaf said passionately, My lord, I think it would be a great dishonour, both to me and to my father, were I to ride brideless from Bretterstein, where all have held us to be betrothed for 10 years. But I also had the thought that when I come home to my native place, where no man knows me, I could have no better wife than the one with whom I have been friends from childhood." "How old were you when you lost your parents, Olav?" asked the bishop. "I was 7 years old when my father died, and I was motherless in my hour of birth." "And my mother is still living," Lord Thorfinn said, and sat silent a while. "I see it is natural you should not wish to lose your playmate." He rose, and Olaf sprang up at once. The bishop said, "You know well, Olaf, that motherless and friendless you are not. No Christian man is that. You, as we all, have the mightiest brother in Christ, our Lord, and his mother is your mother, and with her, I trust, is your mother who bore you. I have always thought that the Lady Sancta Maria prays yet more to her Son for those children who must grow up motherless here below than for us others. True it is that no one should forget who are our nearest and mightiest kin. But it ought to be easier for you to bear this in mind. You will not so lightly be tempted to forget what power of kindred you have in the God of peace, since you have no brothers or kinsmen in the flesh who might draw you with them to deeds of violence and arrogance, or egg you on to revenge and strife. You are young, Olaf, and already others have drawn you into blood guiltiness. You have thrust yourself into strife and litigation. God be with you, that you may become a man of peace when you are answerable for yourself." Olaf knelt and kissed Bishop Thorfinn's hand in farewell. The bishop looked down at his face and smiled faintly. "You have a headstrong look. So it is. God and his gentle mother preserve you, that you grow not hard-hearted." He raised his hand and gave the young man his blessing. On reaching the door, Lord Thorfinn turned with a little laugh. "One thing I had forgot, to thank you for your help. My Asbjorn, Allfat they call him, spoke of how you had already lent him a hand since you came here. I thank you for it." Not till the evening, when he was in bed and about to fall asleep, did the thought cross Olaf's mind like a chill breath, what he had said to Bishop Thorfinn about himself and Ingunn. It was not altogether truthful. But he banished the thought at once. Now, of all times, he had no desire to think upon last summer and autumn, the nights in the bower, and all that. He felt at home in the bishop's palace, and every day the life seemed better to him, with only men around him, all older than himself, and all with their regular tasks to perform, hour by hour. Olaf followed on the heels of Asbjorn Allfat wherever the priest went. There were 4 men in the loft room where Olaf and Arnvid slept. There was a young priest who had been at the school with Arnvid besides Asbjorn, who was a good deal older than the others, close on 30. Arnvid went to church and sang the daily office with the clergy, and he had borrowed the book from which he had learnt when he was a pupil in the school, and sat amusing himself with it in the leisure hour after breakfast. He sat on the edge of the bed, reading aloud the first pieces that were written in it, De Arte Grammatica and Nominali. Olaf lay listening to him. It was strange how many names these men of Rome had had for a single word. See, for instance. At the end of the book were some leaves on which to practice the art of writing. Arnvid diverted himself by engrossing letters and sentences after the old copies. But it was chilly work in the cold loft, and his fingers had lost their cunning for such things. One day he wrote at the end of his copy, "It was badly written, for the pen was lame." But when he had put the book away and gone out, Asbjorn Priest took it and wrote in the margin, "Who knows not how to write, his pen will blame." Olaf smiled quietly when he was told what it meant. Asbjorn Allfat said his Mass early in the morning, and Olaf usually went with him to the church. Often he did not go there again on weekdays. At most times Asbjørn priest was exempted from service in the choir and read his hours from a book, wherever his duties might call him. He had much to do with the incomings and outgoings of the sea, received rents and tithes in kind, and spoke with people. The priest taught Olaf to inspect goods and judge their quality, and how each kind should best be stored. He explained to him the laws of buying and selling, and of tithes, and showed him how to use the abacus. Mjøsen was not yet frozen over off the town, and folk came rowing and sailing thither. Asbjørn priest took Olaf with him several times on short journeys. He also bought 2 brooches of Olaf, so now the boy had ready money in his belt for the first time in his life. In this way it was not much that he saw of Ingunn. He kept his word to the bishop and sought no meeting with her except in church. But she seldom came there before one of the later masses, and Olaf was usually at the first. Arnvid often visited the house where the Steinfinns' daughters were lodged. From him Olaf heard that the Lady Munhild had been far from gentle with her niece. In her words, Ingunn had let herself be seduced, and Ingunn had replied to her aunt in great wrath. The Lord Thorfinn had been very friendly when he spoke with Ingunn and Tora. He had sent for them to see him one day. But Olaf was not at home when the maids came to the bishop's palace. He had accompanied Asbjørn Olfat on an errand to Holy Isle that day. Nor could they have much speech together those times when they met in church, and he afterwards walked with her the little way down to the house by Holy Cross Church. But he himself deemed it best so. At times, indeed, he would remember how it felt to hold her in his arms, so soft and slight, so warm and loving. But he thrust the thought from him. Now was not the time for such things. They had all the years before them to live together as good and loving friends. He was so sure that Bishop Thorfinn would help him to get his rights. And besides this, he felt, as it were, a dislike to thinking of the life of the last months. Now that it was over, it seemed so unreal, well nigh unnatural in his memory. Those nights in the bower with Ingunn in black darkness. He lived and felt with all his senses wide awake, except his sight. It was so dark he might as well have been blind. All day long he went about half asleep and caring for nothing, feeling only the strain and uncertainty of all that threatened him from without, like a booming inside his dazed and empty head. Somewhere deep down within him he was always uneasy, even when at the moment he could not tell what was the newest thing that afflicted his conscience. He knew that there was something wrong, and that soon he would feel its urge. Even when he was alone with Ingunn, he could not forget it quite. That something was out of gear. And then she irked him a little, because she never seemed to be tormented either by fear or doubt, and he grew tired of her, because she would always have him gay and wanton and ready to caress her. It distressed him not the least that he was now forced, for a while, to lead a life in which there was no place for women and secret love. The bishop himself was seldom seen by Olaf. So far as his office permitted, the Lord Thorfinn lived according to the rule of the order he had entered in his youth. His bedchamber was over the council hall, and there he worked, said his hours, and took most of his meals. From this room a stair led down to the chapel in which the bishop said his mass in the morning, and from the balcony, which ran outside the rooms of the upper story, a covered bridge led across to one of the chapels of Christ Church. Many of those who dwelt in the bishop's palace were little pleased that they had gotten a starveling monk for their lord. The late Bishop Gilbert had kept house like a great noble, and yet he had been a devout priest and an able and zealous father of the church. Asbjørn priest said he liked this bishop well, but he had liked the old one better. Bishop Gilbert had been a man of cheer, a great saga man, and the boldest of horsemen and hunters. Olaf thought that he had never seen a man who sat his horse more freely and handsomely than the Lord Thorfinn. And in every way a lordly house was kept, though the bishop himself lived so strictly. Every guest who came to the palace was sumptuously entertained. Every serving man was given strong ale every day, and mead on holy days. At the table in the bishop's guest hall wine was served, and when the Lord Thorfinn himself ate with the guest he specially wished to honour, he had a great silver tankard set on the board before him. During the whole meal his cupbearer stood by his high seat and filled the tankard as often as the bishop gave him a sign. It was a fine sight, thought Olaf, to see Lord Thorfinn take the cup, sip it, bowing with graceful courtesy toward him with whom he drank, and give it to be borne to him whom he honoured thus. On the evening that Thor Bring of Vik was there, it fell to Olaf's lot that the Lord Thorfinn drank with him. After supper the bishop had him summoned from his seat far down the table. He had to come forward and stand before the bishop's chair. Lord Thorfinn raised the tankard to his lips and handed it to Olaf. It felt icy cold in his hands, and the wine had a pale greenish look in the bright silver vessel. It was sharp and sour, and pricked the boy's palate. But he liked the taste for all that. It was fresh, a drink for men, and afterwards it warmed his whole body with a rare festal glow. He shook his head when Bishop Thorfinn smiled and asked, "Maybe you like mead better, Olaf?" Then he asked what Olaf had thought of the service that day. There had been a festival mass and procession in the morning, and then he bade Olaf drink again. "You are happy now, I dare say. I think we may be well content with what Thor has spoken." The bishop had not been able to get any satisfaction from the lady Marnhild. She would give no opinion as to what had happened at the thing that time. She was inclined, indeed, to believe that her brother had thought of a marriage between Olav Audunsson and one of his daughters, at one time in any case, but never that the match as made and settled. But Thor Vik declared that he was sure of it. Steinfinn and Audun concluded a bargain about their children that evening. They had given each other their hands on it, and Thor himself was the one who had struck the bargain. He named 3 or 4 men who had witnessed the taking of hands, and who were still living, so far as he knew. What agreement was made as to settlements he did not know, but he had heard the men discuss it on a later day. He even remembered that Audun Ingolfsson would not hear of an equal division of property, unless Steinfinn increased his daughter's dowry a good deal. "My son will be much richer than that, Steinfinn," Audun had said. During Advent, Arnvid went home to his farm in Elfadal for a space, and Olaf went with him. Olaf had not been there since he was a little boy. Now he came as the master's friend and equal, looked about him with discerning eyes, and put in his word as a man who himself had one thing and another on his hands. Here Arnvid's mother ruled supreme, and she received Olaf with both hands, since he had upset Kolbein's plans for Ingunn. For she sincerely hated Kolbein and all the children her brother-in-law had had with his leman. Mistress Hilleborg was a proud and handsome woman, old as she was, but there seemed to be a coolness between her and her son. Arnvid's children were 3 pretty, fair-haired boys. "They take after their mother," said Arnvid. Olaf was well pleased with the thought that he would be a master himself when he came home to Hestviken. Just before Yule, the friends returned to the town. Arnvid wished to keep the feast there.